like this is all going to be going out.
Yep, I know.
Okay, ready?
Yep.
All right, let's do it. So here's the part where we have that weird, awkward delay between the starting of the show and us knowing that we're live.
All right.
You ready?
Versus number 2.
Versus number 2.
All right.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Hey, everybody.
Hey.
I'm waiting for the thing to pop up over there, but it's not going to for a minute.
No. We're trying something different because we had the kind of clacking sound, that stuttering that was going on.
Yeah.
We're adding a delay and seeing if that kind of gives us enough buffer to prevent that from happening in the future.
Yeah, so that's the hope. Welcome to our second episode of Versus. This is a long time coming. I know we had talked about a couple different topics a different couple of times, so I'm excited to finally be here talking about it again. We were initially going to talk about, is apologetics inherently dishonest?
Oh, that's right.
And I feel like everybody was super intrigued by that because Eric's response was no, and my response was yes. And so we were like, oh, let's do a versus about this. But then we actually got to talking on our own and realized that we actually did agree. It was just we were using different language. Like you meant apologists. Are you making the assumption that all apologists are dishonest? And I was like, oh no, I just mean like the practice of apologetics. You were like, oh yeah, I totally agree with that. So we were like, oh, we can't do a versus on this because it would be 2 seconds long.
Yeah. And yeah, it's not enough for like a versus, but there are just enough caveats to still make me uncomfortable with that statement.
We are going to be talking about virtue, which is another ongoing conversation that we have had.
We've been having this conversation since we've known each other. One of the first times we hung out, you and I sat down with a bottle of tequila. Yep. And decided that we were going to discuss the nature of virtue. And anytime that one of us appealed to
utilitarianism,
we'd take a shot.
Yep.
And that's how we knew before anything ever happened romantically that
this is a good person. This is one of my kind of people. Yeah. And we got super drunk because it's really difficult to talk about virtue without like kind of smuggling in a bunch of utilitarian beliefs. So we're going to kind of give an overview, get into the dialogue of like where this kind of started, why we were like disagreeing at first, kind of where we've come to, and then kind of dive into should we have them, because there's kind of 2 parts. It's like the what are they, because it feels like everyone has their own definition of it. And then the second part is, okay, so if we agree on a definition, if we find one that we can work with, what do we do with that? Is that something that we can actually use moving forward to like help us live better lives? Absolutely. And just, I mean, before we dive too far into it, we do have a couple of things that I just want to get out of the way. Absolutely. About. Go for it. Versus, one of them is we drink during this show. Yes. So I've got my regular gin and tonic. And what do you got today? I've got one of my favorites, a bottle of Sloan whiskey, because I'm sheep and Irish. Slane. And I am very excited about this. Good. Yeah. Good. Okay, so here's the deal, you guys. Everything that these videos make, 100% of it, you know, normally always live chats or super chats go towards our annual goal. This year it's of getting an editing computer and getting a producer. That is doubly true of this. Also any AdSense, anything that comes in related to this video is going to be going directly to that goal. So if you want to support us that way, drop a super chat, or if you just like what we do and you want to support us as regular, we will not be ever, well, we haven't been and we won't, I don't think, charge for these. These are not something that patrons pay for. This is free content for everybody, including our patrons, just because we like hanging out with you guys. And we think that this is a good way to kind of connect on the conversations we want to have during the show, but would be very awkward to get into with a caller on the line. Oh yeah, and it would take the entire show. Yeah, so we were like, okay, well, if we're going to deviate in this way, let's just make a second kind of live stream about it.
Yeah.
And then the only other thing is sometimes we have call screeners on with us to allow you to call into Versus and give us your 2 cents. Very short, very quick calls. We don't have anybody on call screening tonight. So
everyone's busy.
Everyone's busy. And to be fair, I was very last minute in being like, hey, does anybody want to help out? And so that was on me. No judgment at all. We're actually going to just dive right in and probably forget everything else.
Yeah, we're going to be keeping an eye on the super chats, though, or not just the super chats, but the live chat. So if you do have something to say, we're going to try and keep an eye there. If we don't get to you,
yeah,
it happens.
And if you would like, super chats are going to, instead of reading them at the end of the episode like we do with Skeptic Generation, we will read them as they come in if they have something to do with the topic. So if you have to, like, if you want to weigh in on something, drop a super chat. We will see it. We'll read it out and kind of encompass that in our conversation.
Sounds good.
Cool.
Okay, now let's get to brass tacks.
All right.
We're talking about virtue.
Yes. Should we have it? What is it? Is it helpful?
Well, you made this graphic. I'm going to show it off. Oh yes. Okay, sorry.
All right. Yeah. Okay. So this is. I have feelings about this, and.
It was a core disagreement.
It was.
We've argued about this while we've gone camping for days on end. We have spent so many evenings arguing about this.
We called your mom in the middle of the night to get her take on it because we were at a diner and just like it was like 10:30, 11 at night. And we're just like, but what about this?
Yep.
Oh my gosh. Yep. Yeah. So we've gone over this, but my general consensus so far, and I stand by it, and maybe we can change my mind on this tonight. I don't think we need virtue. I don't think we should make virtue something we focus on. I don't think that virtue is something that is useful to society.
Well, when you talk about that, you're carrying this implication that we agree on what virtue is. So let's talk about what virtue is first. When I think people first interact with it, at least the first time I interacted with virtue, it was in a religious context. There were different...
The Book of Virtues. Did anyone else read the Book of Virtues?
I vaguely remember it.
Like the story about the giant and the garden. Very, very weird, like trippy kid stories in this enormous honking book, just like just a chunk. I would carry it around with me just because I liked having a big book in my hands. But yeah, it was very religious. It was very much tied to this is something that a good person has, and the virtues were, for me, very much aligned with the fruit of the Spirit, right? It was very much tied into that concept of these are things that you get once you become a good person, you know?
Well, I mean, there are definitely behaviors that you would look at. There are behaviors you would look for in order to determine whether or not that's a good person, right?
Yeah.
And so we have virtues like humility. We have virtues like chastity. What are other virtues?
That's a good question. That's another point of concern for me is it feels like everyone kind of decides what their virtues are. So there isn't like an actual list. I know there is a list, but I don't think most people today who would say that they have virtues would use chastity as an example.
No, but protecting a woman's virtue is something that is kind of like ingrained.
I guess that is used in that context, isn't it? Weird.
It is.
Okay.
So I just Googled it, and courage, justice, temperance, humility, kindness, prudence, patience, compassion, faith, gratitude, forgiveness, cleanliness, hope, charity, generosity, integrity, honesty, sincerity, honor, love, self-control, moderation, diligence, and wisdom.
I feel like that's a very broad list of a bunch of really different categories of things.
It definitely seems easy to be virtuous if you were just cherry picking.
Right. Like, I'm like, okay, well, like something like love or courage or like some of these things are just like brain states. And other things are like cleanliness. Like,
well,
that feels like on a completely different level than like courage or wisdom. Also, you know, make your bed.
Well, there's a deeper truth to
if you dare invoke the Jeep, we are cutting this short.
Okay. So we spent a lot of time talking about it and kind of breaking it down in the way society talks about it and the way that we personally deal with it. Because when I left my faith, I still maintained this idea of virtue. And you pushed me hard. And one of the first things that you asked me was, are you just talking about morality?
Yeah.
Right?
Right, yeah.
And I thought about it and I thought, you know, if something is moral, does that make it also virtuous, or where do those break apart?
Right, and then you get ethics involved and you're like, oh, okay, so somebody who does have like a utilitarian worldview, oh my goodness.
Jacob
Marino. That's amazing. Thank you so much. Jacob says, finally got to catch you both live. Thanks for the show and the consistent willingness to grow intellectually. Love you both. That's incredible.
You too. Thank you.
Yeah, we love you too. For you can buy our love.
Absolutely, you can.
That's amazing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So
talking about ethics and morality.
Yeah. So we've got ethics, we've got morality, we've got virtue, and
well. I mean, and if you're cutting all these pieces of the pie, where is virtue left?
Right. Exactly.
So, okay, if we're talking about saving someone from a burning building,
yeah,
are we talking about ethics? Is it a morality question? Is it a virtue question?
That is a good question, first of all. It depends on the context we're talking about it. Should one be willing to sacrifice oneself for someone else? I think that's a morality question. If it's how do we structure society in a way that ensures people get saved from burning buildings, that's an ethics question. Is it, but like the virtue piece to me gets lost in there, because I'm like, okay, those are kind of the two big questions to me, are like the practical, how are we structuring this? What does this look like in action? And the more philosophical, the more like heady, like what does it mean? Why do we do it?
And I actually take one more piece of it.
Okay, what is this other piece?
Ought I be the kind of person who would rescue someone from a burning building?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so
it's when I talk about virtue and I think about virtue, I think about it as something that you perform for yourself. It is something entirely constrained to your own head. And when you're talking about virtue, people assume all of these things: courage, justice, temperance, humility. But that's just not how that works. Your virtues are those things you perform for yourself to convince yourself that you're a good person.
Okay.
It's not necessarily strictly moral. It's not necessarily strictly ethical. And I think the best examples of virtue are when you strip those things away so that you can zero in on what your views of virtue are.
I wonder because, and I know we've kind of come to an agreement on that definition in the past, like you have brought that up, and I think that's a valid way of looking at it, because that explains why everybody's virtues are different. Everyone is thinking about what makes me feel like a good person, essentially. What actions, what brain states, apparently, make me feel like a good person. But the let's go here for a second. The opposite of virtue is
let's see, sloth, gluttony.
Right. What are those?
Those are the I forget.
Rhino.
Republican in name only?
No. The vice.
The vices? No.
Right. Vices.
Okay.
So vice, rhino. I was trying to jog your memory. Okay. Virtues and vices are kind of like the two sides of that coin. When we talk about virtue, the implication is that you aren't doing these other things, right? A lot of the virtues like chastity, like moderation, like diligence, like all of these concepts are inherently not sloth, not lust, not gluttony, right?
Yeah.
So do we need to talk about vices at all? So are they, because to me, vices are not actually things that are for you, but for others. Like, I drink whiskey. There are people who would say that is a vice. Alcohol is a vice. Mm-hmm. And that's a judgment from other people. But I don't feel like a vicious person who is bad because I do this thing. Mm-hmm. But I also don't believe that virtues are useful. So maybe that's just me.
Well, the thing is, I think you're trying to apply virtue where I think it doesn't belong.
Okay.
I think that, as I said before, virtue is entirely within your head. It's by V, for V, and that's where it ends. And so when you are judging someone else upon what you think is virtuous, that judgment goes as far as the back of your eyeballs. And that's where it ends, because what you find virtuous in yourself is not what another person finds virtuous in themselves. I feel like writing down those virtues and vices mm-hmm. is kind of this futile effort to catalog what people think, those virtues maybe should be, but it's so it tenuous, I think, is
malleable, amorphous.
Amorphous, I think, is a better word. There we go. It's so amorphous that doing that, I think, won't get us anywhere. And
so a vice then would be a person looking at somebody else and saying, that is not something that I would feel good about doing. Therefore, I am going to judge that person for doing it. Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. And that kind of gets to the crux of why I don't think virtue or vice is useful, which is it's very myopic. It's very
absolutely
individualistic. It's very self-centered. It's saying, I am going to create this inherent moral structure that is just for me, but I'm also then going to use it to judge other people.
But you live in a society that has implicit virtues and vices that you have to deal with. There are some things that, as I spoke before, right? Protecting a woman's virtue.
Can you go any deeper there?
Protecting a woman's virtue.
In a world.
It's not something that, that is going out of fashion. But it is definitely a societal push on a virtue. And I think that again, that's a misapplication of what virtue is. Anytime people try and say, try and apply their virtues to someone else,
right.
Again, this is not ethics, not morals. This is entirely in your head, what you think you ought to do to be a good person.
Okay.
So, yeah, no, if you're going to, if you are fine, you're able to drink in moderation and you're living a healthy life, that is not a vice for you. For somebody that might be an issue for, or for someone who maybe grew up in an environment where that was a vice for their parents or, adults around them, mm-hmm. then I can absolutely imagine other people thinking of alcohol as a vice. Okay.
So you're defining these well, and I think we agree, and I'm curious what you guys think. Does this make sense as kind of a third category, not necessarily talking about morality in any kind of global ontological sense, and not talking about ethics in terms of like how we structure a moral society? Mm-hmm. It's just...
It is a performance that you're putting on for yourself all of the time.
Okay, but here is my concern with that. If I were to grant that, which I'm happy to because I think it's a good definition.
It's one we can work with.
If I were to grant that, that still has virtue being this kind of vestigial organ.
I agree.
And I don't think that it is useful.
I don't either.
Okay. So why do you have them? Because I know that you do.
I do. In a huge way.
You are such a virtuous person, and it's actually intimidating. It's not necessarily a compliment, my love. You are so intimidating in how strongly you feel about the things that you think are virtues or vices. And you don't use the term vice, but you do use the term virtue, and you do hold yourself to these standards like humility. Let's get into humility a little bit, because we've talked about this before.
Oh my gosh, yes. Okay. I think that is something that I am currently trying very, very hard to break down.
Yeah.
It is a wall that we have found that I really didn't realize was an impediment until our conversations about it.
Yeah.
But I had always thought that being humble was a virtuous thing, right? Practicing and performing humility made me a better person, or it made me the kind of person that I thought, I wanted to aspire to be.
Okay.
Right?
A good person in Eric's mind was a humble person.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so I would perform humility.
Yeah.
People might take that out of context and think that, that's dishonest in some way. So I guess I better hang a lantern on that.
Yeah, because you use that phrasing a lot: performing humility, performing shame, like this concept of conveying it to someone else instead of just having it happen up here.
Absolutely, I think everyone does it. It is something that everyone does, and often we don't realize we're doing it, and it sounds weird and it feels weird, but when you are sad, you are also performing what society understands sadness to look like.
Well, yeah, it's like wearing black and covering your head when you're
being solemn,
when you're grieving,
acting morose. It's not for people who have experienced grief. Does grief always mean that you're in a constant state of grief like that, and yet you find yourself performing that?
Right, because if you say that I am grieving, you then have this weight of other people expecting you to look like you're grieving.
And if you're not, then, well, you must not have cared.
Right. So for you, performing humility is feeling like you are a humble person, but also making an effort to convey that to other people.
Absolutely.
Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, and a lot of that had to do with not self-promoting.
Okay. Yeah. No, that is a thing, and that's a problem. Honestly, like within this community at large, I feel like there is a lot of that kind of residual feeling of like, if I promote myself, if I make money off of a thing,
you're just doing it for the money. How dare you, intrude upon this pure, exchange of ideas in being in the atheist movement. If you're ever going to make money, shame on you. Shame, ring the bell, trot you through town naked.
But not even just that. It's the concept of don't promote yourself, don't put yourself out there for new opportunities, don't ask to be included in things. Because if you are sufficiently talented, that humility will be the thing that sells you to other people. And that's not true for anybody except for a very specific group of people who are very used to being given shit.
Yeah, there's a very, very small group of people who can sit and wait for opportunity to come knocking on their door. The rest of us actually have to work for it.
We have to get off our butts and hustle.
But you know what? That hustle also happens in the background.
Yeah.
The Four Horsemen. When I was getting really, really involved with the ACA, for the longest time, I really, really wanted to become the fifth horseman. Somebody actually had called me that in a post, and I was just like, that is my life's ambition. That is what I want now. I want that so badly. I'm never going to call myself that. I want other people to call me that.
Right.
And it didn't happen.
Well, you're in better company outside of that.
Yeah,
but
true.
Also,
but this was it was a little different.
Hey, it's a dream that every person in this movement, I think, probably secretly has at some point.
But I didn't realize just how much marketing Dawkins, Dennett, Hitchens, and Harris did to label themselves the four horsemen of atheism.
Exactly. They called themselves that after releasing a conversation like the one we're having now.
And titled it
the Four Horsemen of Atheism, and sent it out in VHS tapes. Yep. Like that was the level of, hey, this is a thing that we're going to do. This is the name we're going to call ourselves. And people were like, yeah, sure, let's go with it.
Yeah.
But the same people who are like, yeah, sure, let's go with it, have this internalized sense of humility as a virtue that stopped them from doing that.
Yep.
And that's where I have a problem with it.
Absolutely.
Because for me...
That's why I'm deconstructing it.
Right. And for me, I don't see any practical use for humility outside of it benefiting the people that you are not combating. Right? It's very useful. And I know that I'm sounding like Nietzsche right now. I'm aware that I sound like a 14-year-old goth kid who just found Frederick.
Okay, the fact that you assume that 14-year-olds know Nietzsche.
Oh, have you? we have different experiences with 14-year-olds apparently.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
I was homeschooled.
Yeah.
Enough said. As I fix my glasses.
Yeah.
No, so like here's the thing. It's very useful for a small demographic of powerful people who exploit others to propagate the concept of things like humility, or these virtues that are things like being meek, being like a lot of women in Christian circles
would hold that as a virtue.
Deal with the same stuff. Oh, you are meek, you are quiet, you are submissive. Those are virtues. Those are good. Those virtues don't benefit those individuals except for keeping them out of trouble for breaking them sometimes. But a lot of the time what ends up happening is those virtues get exploited and those people become victims. And the only use that I am finding for things like humility are keeping people who would otherwise put themselves forward and say, no, I deserve better. No, that's a bad idea. I have a better idea. Treat me better. Stops them from doing that.
I agree.
Okay, but you still have humility as a virtue.
So I think this is now a confusing what is and what ought.
Okay.
When I say that I view this as a virtue, I'm not explaining myself well, because when I'm saying I view it as a virtue, I'm saying when I think that I'm not being humble, I feel bad about myself. And there's a level of self-punishment that goes into it that I'm used to performing for myself, right? There's a performance of shame that I do for myself, which helps no one.
Right, and that's the secondary virtue complex kicking in, where it's like, oh no, you didn't do this virtue well.
Self-flagellate.
Quick, perform another one.
But this is me just being honest about where my shortcomings are. This is me telling you, hey, here's something that I'm bumping up against. I don't want to view that as virtuous, but until I work my way through it, especially you, I love you. You're my partner in life. I want you to know where I'm having issues here.
Yeah.
And so that's where the is comes from. And the ought is I ought not to have that virtue or view that as a virtue. But until that happens.
Right. But now we come in and I'm more than willing to put myself on the chopping block here, because we've just talked about this in a way where I have expressed an unspoken virtue of not holding virtues that do not benefit you. So you just said I ought not have this virtue, which is the language of holding virtues. And I agree with that, which means I agree with that virtue of not holding virtues.
I think let's save the meta-analysis for a little bit later. Otherwise, we're just going to wind up with our heads entirely up our asses in the first half hour of the. Hey,
this is what this is for. If people did not want to see our heads up our ass, I'm sorry. This is the
we're glad you're here,
live
everybody.
stream.
Okay. I really don't know where to go with that, to be honest. So let's put a pin in that.
Okay. I do want to come back to that though, because I want to dive into that a little bit. But
okay.
Where would you like to go from here?
Well, I just kind of want to flesh this out just a little bit more. So we've talked about and agreed on what virtue is. We've given this definition, and then we've kind of explored it and applied it. Mm-hmm. Are there places where virtue can be a good thing? Or is virtue always a bad thing?
Okay, I like this direction. We can go this direction.
I think that there are some things that I would view as virtuous that I would continue to see as virtuous.
Okay, I have feelings already, but continue. What are some of those virtues that you would continue to see as virtuous even after deconstructing this?
Sure. So if I deconstruct modesty, I've deconstructed modesty. I have not deconstructed virtue.
Right.
So in the chat, what do you view as what could be a positive virtue? I think that honesty generally is a virtuous thing.
But let me push back on that. Mm-hmm. If we're granting that a virtue is something that is individually held by a person, mm-hmm. right? How you define and use honesty mm-hmm. is going to be very different from how person A or B uses or defines honesty. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of people who use I'm an honest person.
To give half-truths, to bend things to their...
Well, no, to just be an asshole and be like, oh, well, I'm just honest. I'm sorry. I'm going to tell you to your face that your haircut looks awful. Those glasses don't fit your face, and that shirt is stupid. Die alone. Right, like, I'm just honest, and that's a virtue for me. So for me, I'm not talking about honesty. Honesty can stay or go, but that concept of this is a virtue and therefore it is justified is where I'm having the problem. And I don't see that as being solved, even if we find individual virtues that I think are useful. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's because you're using it the wrong way.
I'm so confused. How am I using it? How should I be using it?
Sure. When I'm talking about humility, or I'm talking about modesty, or I'm talking about charity, or I'm talking about honesty, mm-hmm. all of these things, again, when we're talking about virtue, we need to keep it in its own pool. This is my understanding of my things. And so if we work through this, we have now worked on Eric's view of X.
Right.
You're treating this as if talking about this is going to solve it for everyone, or that we should apply these things largely, or that these things ought to be applied.
Got it.
And so it's not useful in this context.
Well, this is kind of, I think maybe this is where we need to break it down, because this is where I want to go. I don't want to break down Eric's individual virtues. I don't think that's very interesting for people. I think you're an interesting person, but I don't think that that's like the best use of our time.
I agree, but I think that's the only way we can talk about virtue.
I disagree. I think that breaking down virtue as a construct is where we need to go, because that is going to be what keeps people from using things like virtue and vice to judge themselves, judge others, and get themselves out of situations where they would actually have accountability.
I agree. Before we do, Jacob Moreno sent a $20 super chat. Thank you, Jacob. And says, humility keeps us from supremacy. The problem is that it becomes weaponized, specifically by the supremacist. I don't think it should be viewed as a virtue, rather as a useful tool is used correctly and without dogma.
And see, this is where...
That's because moderation is a virtue.
This is where I both agree and disagree. And this is a really good kind of encapsulation of, I think, exactly where we're going. Mm-hmm. I agree that humility, if used in the way that I define humility, will keep people from being supremacists. But I also know that the term humility, by and large, feels like it is used by people who also adhere to a lot of supremacist ideology. The concept of virtue and vice feels inherently very supremacist.
Well, I think that Jacob was pointing that out. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, like, I don't know if humility keeps us from supremacy, because I know a lot of supremacists, not personally, who would consider themselves humble. So my concern here is not that I disagree with the ultimate point, which I do. My concern is that using these words ends up being useless in any practical sense if what we're striving for, and maybe this is an assumption that I'm making, is a more ethical society.
No. You're using it wrong. It has nothing to do with ethics. It has nothing to do with morals. It has to do with what you are performing for yourself to feel like a good person.
Right. But I think that focusing on what I need to do to feel like a good person is not useful if the goal is to actually reduce harm and benefit others.
Well, I agree. And watering my plants isn't going to help my car get better mileage on the freeway. I really don't care what's reducing harm. It has nothing to do with virtue.
That's going to get clipped in weird ways.
Yeah, but it's true, because we're not talking about reduction of harm in society. You're applying the wrong standards to virtue. So helping your neighbor, right, your elderly neighbor, shovel the snow from their driveway, I would view as a virtuous act. Tell me how that made a better society.
Because now we are in a space where we are directly impacting each other in a positive way to assist those who cannot help themselves in certain ways. It's
kind of broad, but I'll go with that. Let me see if I can think of a less valuable virtue there. Hold on. How about not getting those milk duds in the aisle while you're checking out at the grocery store and seeing the chocolates right there that are just waiting for you? Choosing not to indulge in that little bit of chocolate. Would people view that as virtuous?
Depending on why. Yeah, absolutely. If you're saying fuck Nestle for using child slavery, then yeah, that's an ethical decision. But if what you're saying is, I think that it is moral to eat clean, quote unquote, whatever that is, then I would say that that has moral and ethical implications for sure, but I disagree with the virtue itself. So like, my concern here is that I know that we're talking...
I'm specifically, I just want to make sure that we're talking about your issue with ethics and whether or not it makes a better society.
Okay, let me tie those two together, because I assumed that we were on the same page there, and I think it's causing confusion.
Okay.
There is a general consensus that virtuous people result in a more ethical society. If you were to ask most people, I guarantee, will virtuous people result in a more ethical society? If there are more people who have strong virtues, will those people form a society that is more ethical?
Okay.
I think that is an assumption that people make, and I think that is the crux of why I don't think that virtue is why I think it's honestly pretty harmful.
Oh, I agree that it's harmful, and it doesn't even need to be part of that view.
Okay.
So just to be clear,
yeah,
I want to separate ethics from virtue. And whether or not most people will think about that, I think that if we were to have that out with anyone who wanted to have that conversation, they will find that virtue diverges from ethics. What someone would find as virtuous in every situation, if you were to go through, name the things that you think are virtuous, you're going to find examples where it has nothing to do with ethics. And because of that, I think that they may run parallel sometimes, but the all-encompassing virtue needing to be tied into ethics, I think is bullshit, which is why at the outset I wanted to separate them.
And I think that separating them is useful in terms of determining what the differences are functionally, but I don't think that we're going to come up with a useful I don't want to say solution because we're not going to solve virtue on this podcast.
No, it's not a problem.
I think it is a problem.
Again, I think you're overstretching. I think that there's gray area. There are things that you could view as virtuous. Mm-hmm. There are some things that you could view as virtuous and it be good. There are some things you could view as virtuous and it not be good. Mm-hmm. And because of that, you can't say that all virtue is bad.
I'm not saying all virtue is bad. I'm saying the concept of virtue is not helpful.
Well, it depends on what you're trying to help. If you're trying to help somebody who's internalized it and are kind of stuck in these ruts where they're constantly performing for themselves, damaging behaviors, then you better start talking about virtue. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to recognize where you're having problems.
I understand why we're talking past each other. I get it. We're looking at this from different perspectives. You're going for the individual. I'm going for systemic.
Right. How can you possibly go through get to systemic if we haven't laid the groundwork on individual?
Because I think I just have a fundamentally different idea of how useful individualism is to systemic change.
Well, congratulations. We can have conversations about systemic change and ethics on other shows. We're talking about virtue, which is, by the definition we agreed on, in the individual. So quit trying to use that as a tool for ethics and morality. It's not. We can have that conversation another time. We're talking about virtue.
Well, the topic is, should we have virtues?
Correct. And
the implication there is that there may be situations in which we should not.
Well, how about there are implications that I should not? The royal we kind of thing, right? Let's look at ourselves in the mirror. Let's have that individual, moment with ourselves where we go, what are the things that I think are virtuous? What are the things that I think make me a good person? And are they really doing that? Or are they harming my ability to live a happy, productive, fulfilled life?
Can you live a happy, productive, and fulfilled life in an unethical society?
Can you do that without water? I really don't care about ethics. We're talking about virtue. Can you have that without oxygen? Why do you keep trying to shoehorn in an ethical society? Those are separate.
I don't think they are. I really don't think they are.
Okay, can virtue exist without ethics? Yes. Can virtue exist with ethics? Well, it obviously does. People view things as virtuous, and I think that we all have understandings of ethics, and we talk about ethics. So ontologically, that's just true. So where are you going with the ethics thing? I'm curious. What does that even matter? Why do you keep bringing it to that?
Because for me, what I see most of the time when virtue comes into the conversation is a deviation from systemic issues to, do I feel like a good person? So a good example of this is Michael Pollan. If you don't know who this is, he is a health nutrition kind of guru.
Okay.
Who coined the phrase, gosh, I forget what it is. It's like eat regularly, mostly greens, like that mostly green things. So like this concept of go to your local farm, don't use other forms of farming. Even organic farms are not helpful to anything. There are so many problems. You need to go to your farmers markets. You need to go to your local farms. That is how you are going to affect change in how we eat. It is a political thing to go to a farmer's market, essentially, was his thesis. And there are a lot of problems with that, not just because he himself misunderstands a lot of things or doesn't touch on some important issues there, but it becomes this situation where an individual person who has the money, time, and opportunity to go to a farmer's market, to feel like a good person, is doing that thing as a virtue, and it's not actually affecting change. In fact, it may be harming things.
Yeah,
so
not everybody has that opportunity.
Exactly. So my concern with the ethics piece is that a lot of the time we are pitched, here is how to be a good person. And the asterisk there is, if you do these things, then you'll help other people too, or you'll reduce harm, or society will get better. It's never just do this thing because it makes you feel good and fuck the reasons why.
Got it.
So my concern is people aren't talking about virtue in the way that you are right now, where it's just something to make themselves feel good.
See, I think they are.
No, they're talking about it as a substitute for ethics.
No, they're lying to themselves, because often people damage each other in an effort to perform virtue.
Exactly.
Which is, yeah.
Right, which is my concern, which is why I think that virtue is harmful on a systemic level, because if we're focused on the individual and what makes me feel good, what do I want to do to be a good person?
Okay.
I'm not listening to what that person needs.
Okay, cool. So virtue is harmful on a systemic level. Are you standing behind that?
Yes.
If I come up with it or find virtues that are not harmful on a systemic level, will that damage your thesis?
No. Because I'm not talking about individual virtues, I'm talking about the concept of virtue.
Oh, okay. Yeah, then I'll agree. That's fine.
That feels like a cop-out, though.
No, because I was thinking, the way you stated that, I was taking that as an all or nothing, very black or white, every time virtue is harmful systemically.
No, it's the same like with AA. So it's like, there is a...
I just want to highlight where I was drawing that difference with you. Mm-hmm. You were saying that as an idea, it is harmful because it does something that people don't think that it actually does.
Yeah.
Or people think that it does something that it doesn't.
Correct.
And I took that as, in every situation, virtue is harmful.
Individual virtues are not harmful.
Okay.
All the time.
So then don't say virtue is harmful, or you could say, I think it's much clearer maybe to say the concept of virtue is harmful if you're using virtue to inform your ethical decisions.
That is a great way to put that. That is my thesis.
Cheers. Cool.
Yeah. That is what I stand by.
I'm fine. I agree with that.
Okay.
Okay, can we dive in on the individual level, or are there more systemic issues that you want to talk about?
I guess my question is, if we agree that the concept is not helpful and in fact harmful in this context, what is the value of diving into the individual? Like, where do you want to go? What is this fascination with, but my virtues? Like, let's deconstruct those individual ones.
So it sounds like we're about to kind of turn the page into something else that I really want to talk about. But first, Jacob Moreno sent $50. Thank you, Jacob.
Jacob.
And says, I agree with V that the concept of virtue is not virtuous in itself, and many times leads to problems due to dogma. However, many actions which are viewed as virtuous are positive and arguably necessary in maintaining a healthy human society.
Correct. Yeah. Absolutely. I fully agree with that.
I do too.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess the last thing I'll say on this, and then I'll let it go, is I'm not just like coming in here to try and tear this idea down. What I'm trying to say is, if we are going to agree that well-being is our moral framework, I'm coming at this from like a secular humanist perspective, right? We want to increase well-being of as many people as possible and reduce harm. If we agree that that is the moral framework in which we live, then I think that virtue does a disservice, because we can access the actions that are viewed as virtuous that positively impact society outside of that construct by talking about it in an ethical way. And so for me, it feels like a deviation that leads into conversations around what makes me individually feel good, which is not, to me, secular humanism.
Gotcha.
So that I will drop it after this, but that is kind of why I was so excited to have this conversation, because I thought that was kind of where we were going.
No, and I'm actually excited to have this conversation entirely not that. And by the way, Gina Gamba is calling you out for being utilitarian in your view of, and you're talking about virtue. So take a drink.
Possibly. You know what? I think I am more utilitarian than I
it definitely
am comfortable admitting.
It definitely is utilitarian. If you're talking about it and only seeing a value in what its practical use is, then yeah, that is incredibly utilitarian. So I agree with you.
Okay.
I think the important conversations to have are ones that are in the realm of talking about virtue. You have done a very good job of shaving off where virtue gets into trouble when talking about morality and ethics.
Okay.
Which is why at the beginning we lined out that it has nothing to do with morality and ethics. If we understand that that is a fundamental problem that people have, fantastic. Cut it off. Cool.
Okay.
What's left? Is there nothing left?
I don't think there is anything of interest left beyond the realm of like therapy.
See,
I think therapy
could
be very useful.
I think what actually virtue is, because it lives in your head, because it's what you perform for yourself. Congratulations. If you're talking about virtue, you're talking about therapy. That's where I think the conversation lives, and that's what I'm excited about.
Okay, so we're getting therapeutic in here right now.
Absolutely. And I feel like any conversations about virtue that aren't therapeutic aren't talking about virtue. And you agree, because you cut that off. So congratulations, you pointed out where that problem is. Great. Now let's talk about virtue.
Interesting.
If you're cutting it off before even talking about it, you're like, okay, we're going to talk about virtue. I'm going to point out what it isn't. Cool. Now we know what it is. Let's talk about it.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm down. Although I do feel like the name of this segment has to change into something like philosophy for like therapy or something, like philosophy therapy or something. Because like we go here way more often than we do like get like combative. Like this isn't technically a versus debate. This is more like using philosophy to therapize each other on live air.
Congratulations, you guys. You have gotten a look into what happens off air.
All the time.
Okay.
All the time. Okay, so thank you for all of that. We are going to leave that aside. I don't think we could have had this conversation without addressing all of that first, to be fair.
I think even if we had had that understanding before the show, having this on air and laying that groundwork, I think is incredibly important. So I'm glad that we kind of shone light into all the corners there.
Yeah. Okay, so from a therapeutic standpoint, talking about our individual virtues, why we have them, what they are, and are they useful? Where do you want to go with that?
Well, I think first thing I want to do is kind of wear my heart on my sleeve and talk about where I've experienced virtue as an impediment in my life.
Okay.
Because I think that people
Do we have like organ music we could play over this?
I think that people watching might have the same problems.
Okay.
So we talked about humility.
Yeah.
Well, I think that viewing humility as virtuous has meant that I've cut myself off from opportunities to promote myself because I thought not doing that would make me a good person. I had actually cut myself off from what other people that I viewed as virtuous were able to do, which was self-promotion.
Right.
And I was just cutting myself off at the knees. So that version of humility is friggin' awful.
Yeah.
I think that Jacob Moreno was talking about humility keeping us from supremacy. So is there a moderate amount of virtue that is virtuous? Are we overdoing the virtue of humility to the point of damage? Is there any
Do we check
value?
humility out of the boat entirely, or
is there a moderate amount that we should have? Or should we view things as, like Jacob kind of pointed out humility as being the other side of the coin of supremacy? And so if you have less humility, do you have more supremacy? And if you have more supremacy, do you have less humility? And I think that if we separate those, maybe that's better. Maybe if we don't view humility as what's keeping us from being selfish assholes, but just as a performance, then is humility as a performance beneficial at all?
Are virtues in general a performance?
I believe that virtues are what you perform for yourself in order to be or feel like a good person.
Interesting. So you don't ever feel like a humble person. You just perform humility because you think it's what you should do, and the performance is what makes you feel good about yourself.
I have internalized a Christian view of myself as a broken, bad person. Mm-hmm. And even though I'm not a Christian anymore, the damage of viewing myself as garbage is still here. It's part of a lasting damage that I'm still dealing with.
Interesting, because to me those are very different things. There's a very big difference to me between being somebody who views themselves as worthless and being someone who views themselves as humble.
Well, but if and I'm being really, really open here, candid. I'm not saying it's an ought thing. I'm just saying an is thing. When I am humble, mm-hmm. I get a small dopamine hit and pat myself on the back and go, I did a good thing.
What does being humble look like?
Well, it depends on the context.
Okay, give me an example. When I am humble, what does that look like?
When I am humble, I downplay my achievements.
Okay.
Again.
But like that's my understanding of humility is there are things to be proud about, but I am not proud of them. As opposed to there's nothing to be proud about. So like it feels like those are almost at odds. You can't actually be a humble person if you think of yourself as broken and worthless, because there's nothing to be humble about in that case. It's just like
then I'm doing a really good job of it.
No, no, not at all.
I'm expressing what is, not what I want to be.
Oh yeah, like
I don't want to
general
view myself as a bad person. I don't want to downplay those things that are genuinely good about me. I don't want to hate myself, and that's something that I've worked on for a very long time. And you've known that as long as you've known me. Mm-hmm. But at least I can be open and honest and try and view this as clearly as possible so that it can be worked on.
Interesting.
So I'm specifically talking about virtue as a what is.
As an impulse.
As an impulse. Yes. Should I? Okay, fine. So that is actually the working title for the book that I'm working on. It's The Virtue Impulse.
Eric is working on a book.
Yes, I think that we get in our own way. And I think that my life is an example of how the virtue impulses that I have had has got in the way of my own happiness, my own growth, my own well-being. And I think that is often what we do professionally. Yeah. Right? I don't want to bring up to my boss that there's, a problem, because that means that I'm not a good enough employee, and that's not that is a bad performance. And so I'm not going to bring up problems, and it's just going to get worse, but I'm going to view myself as good for it. I've got the flu, but I'm going to show up to work anyway. Yep. Because I think that shows that I'm a good employee.
Meanwhile, you get everyone else sick with the flu.
Meanwhile, exactly, right? How fucking virtuous was that? Yeah. You maybe, limit yourself to a severe diet. I'm suffering. But damn it, for some reason that makes me better.
Honestly, the biggest virtue that I think I hold is frugality. Like,
oh, yes, absolutely. Oh my gosh. Spending money, especially if it's on something that I'm going to enjoy.
Oh yeah. But not just spending money
I can spend money on you. V wants a thing, I will sell a kidney. Like, whatever it is, I want to give you the sun and the moon and the stars. But if I need to get myself a hairbrush.
Yeah, that's like, I don't know, $6 is a lot of money for a hairbrush.
If I need pillows or a sheet Or
which is why we do that for each other. Like, I'll take you to go get pillows. Be like, we are getting pillows now because I want you to have pillows. And you're like, okay, well, if you want me to have pillows, then I guess I can get them for myself.
Yeah, or you're feeling bad, I will go and get you 7 different cakes.
which happened. I was like, I want birthday cake, and I feel crummy. And Eric's like, I'm gonna go get you 7 slices of cake. And it was a great night. But it's not just spending money. For example, where I work right now, they don't give you raises. You have salary increase conversations. And so you have a conversation about, here is why I'm bringing more to the table than you're paying me for currently, and why I deserve more money. And it's freaking terrifying.
That sounds awful.
It's really just like a step out of most people's comfort zone, which is why they implement it in that way.
I'm pouring some gin and tonic, more gin and tonic for myself, so I'm just going to mute my mic. But go on.
There's that. Like, that's difficult for me to do. And then things like I moralize virtue-wise. I don't know how to like adjective that. But I have a virtue impulse around feeling hunger. And this is me being super open. This is not something I would ever expect of someone else. In fact, if someone else told me this, I'd be like, oh my gosh, do not do that. That is not healthy. But if I feel hungry, I'm like, I'm being frugal. I'm being smart with how I eat. I'm not overeating, whatever that means. And I hold myself to this frugality virtue, even though I know objectively, like, oh, that is my body saying I need more food. I need more nutrition. Like, so even
denying it that. Oh. Yeah, but denying it that.
Right. And like the objectivity of like knowing the facts around a thing isn't really changing the virtue impulse itself. It's allowing me to counteract it, but it doesn't change it. Like me realizing that, oh, actually 1,500 calories a day is not enough for a grown-ass person to be eating. Yeah. Like, I know this through science, doesn't change the virtue impulse. It drowns it out a lot of the time now that I have been working on that, but it doesn't change it. So the thing that keeps coming to me, though, for all of this is like, we're talking about virtue and they're all bad. Like, we have yet to come up with a virtue in this case where the virtue ends up helping instead of either masking a deeper harm that needs to be addressed or actively hurting other people, like coming to work sick.
But that is how this kind of conversation happens. We provide counterpoints for each other, but we're not just waiting for our turn to talk at each other. We're building upon these things, and as we do so, we're getting a clearer and clearer understanding of the subject. Jacob Moreno, holy crap, Jacob, thank you. Sent $20 and said, I've read the last.
Yeah. What Eric just described regarding his personal humility is what I personally refer to as the pride of humility. Yes, that is a great way to put that. Oh, that's so good. And it was something I can relate to as someone who experienced it a lot in religious circles. Absolutely. That is a really good way to put that. And in fact, I think you could do that probably with most virtues. You could probably be like the gluttony of moderation.
Well, so I think this is a really good time to dip into V's inner 14-year-old Nietzsche. Nietzsche. Excuse me. And do you kind of want to give people that view and that understanding that provides? Because I think it's useful in talking about this specific part.
Well, I mean, here's the deal with Nietzsche, you guys. There's a lot of cringe, and most of it wasn't necessarily his. I don't know how much you know about Nietzsche, his biography, his life story. He went kind of cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs later in life, and his sister, who was a Nazi, took him in, and while she was kind of caring for him, was also actively rewriting his work to align with her ideology. Mm-hmm. So there's still stuff that is like actually like just weird and just off about a lot of what Nietzsche suggests, but a lot of the language and the way that we've internalized it and like read through it is actually his sister. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what Nietzsche says about virtue and morality. He calls it morality, but I think it fits more neatly into this virtue category. With the understanding that there is a lot of cringy stuff there as well. Like the concept of the Übermensch is
cringe as fuck.
Cringy. So essentially, the general conceit is morality that encompasses things like humility, things like silence or submission, or all of these making yourself smaller morals or virtues that a lot of Christianity revolves around, is a way to make yourself feel better about being weak. Like, if I were to summarize all of that and probably butcher it, frankly, feel free to tell me I'm wrong about this, is people who realized that they were never going to be the leaders, they were never going to be the wealthy ones, they were never going to be the rulers, had to make themselves feel like, but I'm really the powerful
so much
one.
Better than the king.
I'm really the good person. I'm really the one that deserves all of that. And the only way that they could do that within a system that was being oppressive was to internalize and then moralize the ideas of things like humility or like submission or turning the other cheek, right? Like, oh, that's a good thing. Why? Because I'm forced to turn my other cheek and I don't have any recourse. And so I'm just going to tell myself that that's
I'm a good person.
Because otherwise I would have to realize that it's not okay to submit myself to that level of like treatment and do something about it, which would then put me in danger. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a defense mechanism.
Right. So it was at this point during the conversation at the diner that deep inside I heard the clink at the bottom of what I had no idea was a very deep well, a very deep and dark well. And as it echoed up, I realized that I had a lot more to dig and a lot more uncovering before I really, really deconstructed what I thought was just implicit. I thought that in that way, humility was implicit and not, I thought it was nature, not nurture. Mm-hmm. But the fact is, it is nurture. And I don't think that necessarily virtues are a tool of the man, but I do think that you're absolutely right. If you have poverty, then why not view poverty as a virtue? Because then you can pat yourself on the back and view yourself as that much more virtuous than those people who don't need to view it as a virtue.
Right, exactly. And it actually helps the people who are in power for you to do that. So they might also perform things like shame or guilt or humility in order to emphasize that is something that you should be doing, mm-hmm. while also on the set, like this is the mega pastor situation in a nutshell, right? Like, oh yes, you should give me your money because that proves that you trust God enough to part with it, and He will grant you more for that
planting
trust.
That seed,
right? Meanwhile, that's not what they're doing. No. They're taking that money and they're hoarding it. So like this idea of.
But also, I think that unfortunately we're viewing this from the lens of people who grew up poor. Because I think that for people who grew up wealthy, wealth itself would be the virtue. And lacking money would be...
I disagree. I disagree. Do you know how many rich people perform minimalism? Why minimalism is considered a good thing?
But how many rich people have also gone, well, if you are poor, then that just shows that you did not have the fortitude to pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Right, which is why it gets into this area of cognitive dissonance where things like capitalism conflict with the morality culture that came about before capitalism was a thing. And so we have this like, well, I'm damned if I do, damned if I don't. If I'm frugal, that means that I'm virtuous, but that also means that I'm lazy. Like, how does this make sense? Because it doesn't make sense. That's really doesn't. Yeah, that's the secret. The reason that it doesn't make sense is because we are trying to cram together different ideologies that came around in different situations. At different times.
Absolutely.
But minimalism is a really good example of how...
a more modern take on that virtue.
Well, it's the probably what I would say is the most effective amalgam of the two. So it's really difficult to be a minimalist if you are poor or if you have grown up poor, because it takes a lot of saving things, reusing things, hoarding things to survive if you are poor. And a lot of that gets into your head. Mm-hmm. If you grew up in an environment where that was necessary, even if it's not anymore, that's kind of the instinct. I need to save these things.
Absolutely.
I'm going to need these later.
Yeah. And for people who are sitting there going, well, no, I was a minimalist because I was poor. That's not what that means at all.
Right. Minimalism in terms of like the aesthetic, right? Like the lifestyle of minimalism. Oh, yes, I live in my little cottage on the hills in the Netherlands, and I only buy super like handcrafted things from my neighbor who charges $500 a chair. Like,
right.
It's this concept of I'm being frugal, but also I am benefiting from the system that rewards not the virtues that I'm imposing on others. So like, no, it's very tricky, which is why I've built, this is why I want to get into the systemic stuff. This is why this is interesting to me, because we always have to end up going up here and being like, where did this come from and why is it being perpetuated?
Well, and I think that I totally understand that. And I just kind of want to provide a counterpoint for people who might be wondering.
Absolutely.
The counterpoint to that in my kind of life was, I grew up with my parents divorced, mm-hmm. and it was with my stepdad and my mom. My stepdad was a construction worker, and he needed to be the Christian head of the household. He needed to be the provider, but work was not always there.
Right.
And because of that, we stockpiled food. Mm-hmm. We stockpiled whatever was available, whatever we could get from Costco, and safety and comfort and security came from looking at the giant stockpile of shelf stable food that you can access if you're not able to afford it later on, right? That security was that kind of poverty. And so when people look at minimalism, when we're talking about minimalism,
right,
that's not minimalism. And that also is an expression of poverty that we both understand.
Right, exactly. We still look at our pantry and like, oh, look at how much stuff is in the pantry. I know we do. Because we're not used to it.
No.
But like that is where the virtue conversation and where I personally deal with the internalized virtue of frugality intersects with that systemic level of, well, why do I internalize? Why have I haven't chosen to be frugal. Like, that's not something I was like, what? Let me look at this list and decide which ones I'm going to inherit. Oh, yes. Like, I think frugality would make sense. Like, that's something I grew up with. And why did I grow up with that? Well, now we get into history, now we get into politics, now we get into the systemic, you know?
Right. I just think that when it moves onto those larger issues, I feel like it gets away from just virtue. You know, if we're isolating virtue, then I think we have to separate out, you know, those larger issues. So we've talked a lot about the damage of virtue.
Right. I would love to see if there are areas where it actually benefits us.
Right. And this is kind of where we want to reach out to you in the live chat. So what would you view as virtuous? What do you perform for yourself to feel like a good person that you think is beneficial?
Yeah.
Because I do think that something like, well, I don't. See, this is the thing. I keep bumping up against it. I wanted to say again that virtue is the opposite of, pride and arrogance and, like Jacob said, supremacy. And it's not.
No.
It's not. Supremacy, pride, and arrogance are their own things. They're not the other side of the coin of humility. You can be proud of your achievements and not be an asshole. You can promote yourself and do it without having your boot on the neck of the person beside you. And because of that, when you conflate the two, you wind up damaging yourself to the benefit of fucking no one. So, sorry.
You got into it for a second there.
Because I'm currently working on it.
Yeah.
I'm currently fighting it. And it's something that right now I'm having issues with.
Well, I think that it's instinctive to think about it as a spectrum, and this may be the only time that V ever says something is not a spectrum, because most things are. But I agree in that I don't think that there's this imaginary spectrum where there's like no pride and then all of the pride, and this is humility on this end, and on the other end there's being a dick. And then you need to find that middle ground between the two. I don't think that it's as simple as that. I think that they are different things. And I think
being a dick is a thing unto itself. Don't be a dick.
Right.
You can be humble and not be a dick.
You can also be humble and be a dick.
Oh, and if go to your nearest church if you want to find plenty of those people.
Exactly. And here we get into the problem of using our definitions for other people. Mm-hmm. And if we are going to say, no, you're not actually humble, your definition of humble is wrong, that then gets us into a really weird, mind, policing territory where we're like, you have to use my definition or you're wrong. I don't think that's the way to do things.
Which is why, unfortunately, virtue needs to be talked about with the individual. And why it's so difficult to have a conversation that's useful for everybody.
Right.
There are a couple things in the live chat that were brought up that I really, really, really want to point out. First, Gina Gamba said, I don't see it as a performance. So again, I think I'm using the word perform in a way that most people don't. In this context, when I say perform, I think a lot of people think of performance as somehow disingenuous, dishonest, or not actually felt. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's true.
Because sincerity is a virtue.
Yes. But anyway, I feel like the example that I gave before is that when you are grieving, there's the feeling of grief, and then there's also the performance of grief. Mm-hmm. You perform grief for yourself. It's what you do to get the feelings out. It's what you do to show people that you're grieving. The performance of grief is not necessarily somehow broken apart from the actual feeling of it. It's just the thing that you do. And so when I say performing, I want to be very clear that I'm not bringing this up in an American Psycho kind of I can't feel things and so I'm doing, you know what I mean?
Right. It's not a lack of feeling,
right.
But...
And it's not a dishonesty. It's just what I'm trying to talk about the action of doing that thing.
I would push back on that though. I think that that's right. I think that is a really good example, the grief especially. But I also think that virtue is insidious in that what it does is you don't perform, and this is just you. I'm not talking about you in general, but for you,
Eric,
you do not perform humility because you actually feel humble. You perform humility because you're worried about not being humble.
So I kind of, I don't know, I kind of want to push back because I don't think, for me personally, I can see that as true. I think what I would see as more true is I perform shame on myself.
Okay.
I perform shame for myself. I find reasons to feel bad about things, and then I punish myself in order to kind of act out that shame.
Ooh.
And so there are lots of times when I will look for reasons to not like myself and then perform that shame. It's not dishonest. I just wring myself out sometimes. And I think lots of other people do that.
Interesting. So
there's no benefit to it. It's freaking awful.
Right.
But pointing it out might help, because at least we can pin it and go, hey, that's something we need to work on.
I'm just so curious now, because we keep talking about, oh yeah, there are definitely virtues that are useful or helpful. Now, and I want to get into that, but we keep going back to, but shame, right?
So, compulsive rambler, and then after Gina, put a thing, and we just kind of got off on a tangent. Sorry about that. Compulsive rambler in the chat said, the virtue of perseverance or determination helps me with motivation to keep trying when I run low on motivation for the thing itself. So let's look at the virtues of perseverance and determination. Compulsive rambler.
I have such a take on this. I know that it will be controversial, but I have feelings.
Well, take another sip of whiskey and then give us your controversial take, while I thank Pride St. Clair for sending us $10. Thank you, Pride. For people who are coming in late, all of this is going straight towards our annual goal of this year. We're getting an editing computer. Why? Because the rig that I have right now is not suited for what we want to do. There are a lot of technical issues that we run into because of that. And also we do want to get a producer so that we're not trying to produce and host at the same time. And so that's what this is going towards. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. This is amazing, you guys. Jacob Moreno, another 20. Oh my gosh. Humility that is tied to the idea of, quote, I'm better than you because I am humble.
Is supremacy, not humility. Rather the pride of humility. So yes, humility is not opposite to supremacy. It's a tool to help prevent supremacy. Entirely agreed. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to touch on this.
So if that's the case, then is humility good?
Right. But like, I think that then gets into, well, you're not using humility in the right way, or you are not actually being humble, which to me becomes this like no true Scotsman area where humility is good as long as we're defining it in this pure, perfect sense that I agree with.
Platonic humility.
Platonic humility. So I do want to touch base on this, like perseverance and determination in terms of being virtues.
Do you view either of those as virtuous? And have you ever?
I have, but I don't anymore.
So, I think
I think we may go in the same direction with this one.
I do. I think that perseverance and determination are things that I kind of wrote off when I work on deconstructing toxic masculinity.
Oh, we are going in different directions. Okay, talk more about that.
Sure. So I think that for people who are raised as boys, there's this idea in this society that things like perseverance, leadership, determination are virtues. They're things that you perform to view yourself as a good person. Mm-hmm. And I think that in kind of taking a look at how my view of masculinity was affecting the way that I lived my life, perseverance and determination needed to go the way of the dodo. Because while I can value perseverance and determination, I don't think that they necessarily make me a good person, because I know good people who aren't necessarily determined and don't necessarily persevere. And I also don't I don't view people without perseverance as bad all of the time. I guess I kind of still do. I still got to deconstruct that a bit.
Yeah, that's definitely a deep-seated one. But here's the deal with where I want to go with this, and that is I have ADHD. So does Eric. And determination and perseverance are things that are very dependent on brain chemistry, brain structure, the kinds of genes that you inherited from your parents, at what point in time your parents actually conceived you, if you have had head trauma. Like, all of these things are very, very physically linked to things like being able to persevere, being able to push yourself to do a thing. And so for me, I wouldn't put that in the virtue category anymore, because
it's gatekeeping.
It becomes a situation where some people just biologically are not able to be virtuous, and that gets us into really weird territory really quickly.
Awful. Yeah.
And to be clear, I'm not saying that this is what the person in the live chat thinks at all.
No, you're talking about yourself on this one.
Right. But for me, it became the situation where I was like, okay, I can no longer view these things as things other people should do, or even things I should be expecting of myself in order to sleep well at night, because of my brain chemistry. And I think that's actually a huge part of why there's such a stigma around medication for things like ADHD, because
it delegitimizes other people's virtue impulses.
The assumption is you're taking an easy way out, or you're getting your perseverance in a bottle, and I do it myself.
That hurts.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I can absolutely see myself like... See, it's easy for me to give other people a pass. It's easy for me to give other people a pass. It's very difficult for me to give myself a pass. Shout out to Mark in the live chat who says Eric is an annoying prick. I agree. I fucking hate that guy, but I'm working on it. And I hope that I don't think that forever.
Oh, Compulsive Rambler says, I also have ADHD, and that's why I use them as virtues to motivate myself.
Oh, how funny.
Yeah. I would say, hey, if it works for you, I'm not going to knock it. But being aware of what we're talking about here, which is this is for me, and we are not going to then move into the space of judging other people for it, is just generally a good idea.
Right. But so then let's kind of wrap it back into talking about virtue, because we've agreed from several different directions that we should not be applying our views of virtue to other people.
Right.
So what is the impact of virtue if it lives in your head and if it's something you perform for yourself?
What's the impact or the benefit?
Well, I think impact includes benefit. It's just overall what is the result of virtue.
I was under the impression that you didn't care about the impact because you didn't want to talk about how it intersected with things like ethics.
I agree. I'm specifically talking about the individual still.
Okay.
What is the impact of a personal virtue?
Real quick, you are kind of cut off on the screen.
Oh.
So if you want to
Yep.
hop over this way.
What is the impact of a personal virtue? I think that we've lined out quite a few of them, right? We prevent ourselves from enjoying things in life that otherwise we would take part in, like getting the Snickers bar when you're at the checkout line, or promoting yourself and giving yourself a pat on the back for a job well done. So let me think. Are there other virtues? Did we see any others in the live chat? What is the value of virtue, and what are some good virtues that we have? Because I still can't accept the idea. It's very difficult for me to accept the idea that virtue is bad in every circumstance. There have to be good virtues. Let's see.
Well, here's where I kind of want to know more about virtue, though, because things I do to make myself feel like a good person could include things like love. Like when I feel love for somebody, I feel like that is inherently a good emotion. And so I feel like a good person for feeling that. But I wouldn't call love a virtue because it's not something that you are making a choice to do. It's an emotion that is kind of just like you can't really help it.
Well,
you can't make yourself love someone that you don't like.
So I think that, okay, I really appreciate that you brought that up, because now I'm able to attack it.
Yeah.
I was not able to attack it before. As a Christian, loving other people was something we told ourselves.
Yeah.
And in loving other people, we justified really shitty behavior, but also we made a show of being kind to people that we didn't like.
Yeah.
Or that were just mean to us. And so when someone talks about love as a virtue, my very first thought is the Christian take on that, which is a really weird dishonesty.
Yeah. It was kind of a given. Like, it was like, I don't feel love for my neighbor, but I'm a Christian, therefore I must love my neighbor. Like, it must just be in there somewhere that I'm not accessing it right now, but like, it must be there.
I think that's closer to what was kind of mentioned in the live chat, somebody saying, well, you know, that's a performance.
Yeah.
You know,
it was real. Like, I assumed I did love all of humanity, but it wasn't like an active feeling or even an action. It was just like oh yeah, I guess I am told that I do that because that's what Christians do, you know?
Oh.
There's an ice cream truck riding by.
Right outside of our window. That's going to be, usually parks right out front too, so it's going to be a little bit.
Yay. We are actually coming up on an hour and a half, so we are going to have to start wrapping up.
Well, especially because I've been holding it for like 45 minutes.
You just want to go get an ice cream cone is what's happening here.
I really gotta. Okay. S. Aston says, without perseverance, we wouldn't be talking right now. I feel like we need to step up and make your mark on life through perseverance and confidence to overcome obstacles. Well, let's break that down, because I think perseverance is beneficial, but I don't think a lack of perseverance is necessarily like laziness. Right. Or that it's somehow, you know, what is the other side of perseverance? It's not perseverance. I think that a lot of people carry with them this idea that if you're not persevering, you are giving up. And I feel like if we separate those, then I think that not giving up is important, but persevering, I have done to my detriment.
Exactly. It can be difficult and harmful ultimately to do that too.
I persevered for over 9 years. 10 years in a relationship that I had fallen out of love in. Mm-hmm. I lost my 20s because of it. Yeah. During that time, I also persevered through a job that did not have upward mobility, that I would have retired making very low wages. Yeah. Because I viewed persevering as a good thing. And so maybe it's not the perseverance. Is it determination? No, maybe not determination.
It's the valuing perseverance for the perseverance's sake, as opposed to valuing what perseverance could ultimately bring you or result in. And I think that's where I have a problem with virtue in general. It's the valuing of a thing for the sake of the thing. I am a humble person, not because humility is going to help me or help other people, but because
in and of itself
is a good thing.
Ooh.
And so for me,
like that. If we get demonetized from the freaking ice cream truck outside, playing,
there's no way.
I'll be so.
The only reason they play these songs is because they're in the public domain. So we're fine. Even if they could even we just stopped for like 30 seconds and just bopped to like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star for a
minute. Dante Verona, that is the sunk cost fallacy. Absolutely.
Exactly. And focusing on virtue, I think, can allow us to be taken advantage of and fall for fallacious reasoning a lot of the time. Yeah.
Now, if the view that something is worth persevering for because you find value in that thing, right, that's moving the value judgment to the thing and not to the act of persevering.
Which is the same with this humility that Jacob is bringing up, right? It's not humility for humility's sake. It's humility in the service of allowing, like, stopping yourself from adopting harmful supremacist ideology. If that's what you value, you don't value the humility, you value not being a supremacist. And so humility becomes that tool.
but it comes at the cost of potential growth, because you can be very proud of yourself and not be a supremacist.
Right, exactly. They are not things that automatically follow. So, I don't know. I feel like we definitely need to wrap up. But I also want
there's so many. There's so like there's
so
opened
much
the doors now.
still.
S. Aston says, agreed, but if you never try and just take a knee in life, are you not retreating from life? Agreed, but that's carrying the assumption that the opposite of perseverance is taking a knee in life.
Right.
And that's not necessarily true. I found value in quitting and turning my attention to activism and starting a new life. I quit, and the act of quitting was the best thing I ever could have done for myself.
Right, which is again, I'm just going to harp on this. The goal was not to persevere. The goal was to find fulfillment and make a positive change.
Right, find the things worth persevering in, but don't just value persevering for perseverance's sake.
Which is what I feel like virtue ultimately does. It becomes a situation where it's a circular valuation of the thing for the sake of the thing.
I'm thinking about that. I do know people who have, like, selflessness. I think is one that I would absolutely agree is useless and dangerous. That selflessness
also, it doesn't really exist.
Is not. Well, I do know people who have stopped their activism in an effort to perform selflessness.
But that by itself is you cannot say selflessness is a virtue if a virtue is to make yourself feel better.
But that's what virtue is.
Right, so selflessness cannot be a virtue.
But if you
have defined a virtue in such a way that selflessness cannot factor into it, because the second that you make a decision because of your virtue of selflessness, the reason you are doing that is selfish.
Or you can just have a very low opinion of yourself, or put yourself
different.
last.
Well, that's different than selflessness.
If you let everybody in front of the line in front of you, is that being selfless? If you got a pizza and you gave all of the pizza away except for one slice, is that selfless?
Well, there are selfless actions, but I don't think individuals are selfless, because if that was the case...
No. I'm thinking of that as a virtue.
As an individual action? Possibly.
As a virtue, I don't think that's beneficial.
Right.
Wow, okay. I really do want to continue this. I want to find where the valuable virtues are. I kind of want to scan the live chat just to see. In my opinion, it's not useful to view specific actions as virtues because it's water from a poisoned religious well. It's more useful to simply view actions as tools to build a particular structure. Agreed.
That's where I was going. I love that. That's a good way to put that.
Unfortunately, I think I'm stuck in a place where until I deconstruct my own virtues, I'm in this really, really bad loop, and I'm working on it because I think it's worth working on.
It is worth working on. My question, though, my question is, I feel like acknowledging that virtues are not useful would go a long way in then helping you to dismantle the things that you thought were virtues.
Agreed. I'm just going to hold out to the last before I'm willing to grant that, because I feel like because it feels so black and white that I have an automatic red flag pop up in the back of my head that goes, if you're going to wipe an entire thing out as bad or not useful, you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater somewhere. And okay, Nathan Kunke sent $50. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you.
Says, there was an Italian economist who wrote about idiots as those who make decisions which detriment themselves and others. Is virtue then acts which benefit others to your own detriment? Sometimes I think that your detriment is not the goal, but you feeling like a good person would be the goal of virtue in the way that we're talking about it. It's something you are doing for yourself to make yourself feel like a good person.
Right, because acts which benefit others to your own detriment could still kind of like the goal of this is to kind of separate it out from morality and ethics, and I think that has a place in both morality and ethics. There are situations in which, like, I pay taxes, I give money that could benefit me in getting 1 billion ice cream cones, and instead what I'm doing with that...
Shout out to T for sending $1.50 for ice cream.
And instead what I'm doing is I am giving that money so that the government can use it to help others, allegedly. So I think that while I agree that this is something that happens and is useful to talk about, I don't know if I would classify it as in the realm of virtue in the way that we've been talking about it.
Nightfire says, I think virtues are things that we evaluate about others. We can't evaluate our own virtues. I disagree, but I think the second part I agree with. It's very difficult to evaluate your own virtues, and it is something you judge others about, but it is something that you perform for yourself, because if you take the second to step back, you recognize that other people have their own virtues in their own heads. And so judging someone else by your own virtue impulse is not necessarily going to help, because if you're talking to someone who views hunger as virtuous and you don't have any common ground. So
I think it's correct as far as vices go. I don't think that in a world where vices were a thing, and I don't think they are, I think that it's easy to pinpoint someone else's vices. Oh, you do this too much, or you do that too much. But, you know,
we can pat ourselves on the back and,
right, exactly, because that's not something that I do, right? It conflicts with my virtues, therefore it is a vice for you.
But then why am I inclined towards self-destructive behavior in order to make myself feel better about myself? Because that is something that I do. So I think that there's still a piece of that. I agree, but I think there's more to it.
Oh, there's definitely more to it. This is an hour and a half on a topic that is ages and ages old and will continue to baffle people. But I do think that
it's a book that I'm working on.
And it's a book that you might solve it. Who knows? Like, you might solve the virtue problem.
I don't think I'm going to solve it, but I think that if I can help point out to people where they might be hurting themselves in an effort to feel better about themselves, basically getting in your own way to the benefit of no one, it's worth doing, because shit, it's something I'm dealing with.
Honestly, my favorite kind of comment for this, like, if you listen to this and you're like, wow, this is your guys' morality or your worldview based on what you've talked about, let us know what we are, because I'm very curious to know where I fall in terms of, like, broader moral philosophical worldviews.
And I would love to hear in the comments from people who heard our things that we valued as virtuous and maybe they don't.
Yeah.
Or maybe other people have a virtue that they think, well, of course, but maybe that's not the case for everyone. I'd love to hear it.
I just appreciate everybody who's kind of tuned in and engaged with us on this, especially the people who have sent super chats and helped us move forward. We have made such a significant jump towards being closer to that goal tonight, like more than we have in the last month. So, like,
Absolutely.
This is incredible, and we really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
We have almost as many likes as we have viewers.
Wow, look at that.
That is huge.
That's amazing. All right, you guys. So here's the deal. We're going to try and do these every couple of months for right now. Mm-hmm. If this is something that you guys want to see more of, please let us know. We really don't want to, like, just clutter up your YouTube just because we like to hear ourselves talk. But we do think that these are fun conversations. We're going to have them anyway. Regardless. So, like, do you guys want in on this, I guess, is the question. And Eric, I just want to thank you for being such an awesome conversation partner. Like, we have gotten super deep on some very, like deep, dark, personal stuff. And it's been just a blast, as always, to talk with you about it.
Well, I love you and I trust you, and I hope that in being vulnerable, I'm able to grow as a person, and I feel safe enough to do that, and hopefully that hopefully doing that where other people can see it can encourage them to challenge those views as well. V, I'm so glad you make me a better person.
I love you so much, and when you get meaningful, you drop your voice by so
really
much.
Quiet.
So you got super quiet there for a minute.
Sorry.
But I love you too, and we love all of you.
Yeah.
So definitely, if you are here for the first time, you don't know what else we do host a call-in show every Sunday at 11:30 a.m. Central, called Skeptic Generation. If you found this, you can find that. We would love to hear from you. If you want to call in about this topic next Sunday, we would love to hear your thoughts. If you disagreed with us, if you have a bone to pick, if you think we're way off base, give us a call and argue with us about it. As you can tell, we love arguing. We love having these intense conversations.
And we get heated, and so many people think, oh, it's heated. There must be issues. No, like when V and I get heated, we get so fucking excited. Like
we're gonna go make out after this.
Absolutely. I'm gonna pee first. And then, we're going to be gross.
All right, you guys, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was a blast. I always love these so much. And give us your ideas about what else you'd like to hear us talk about. If you want a part 2 of a virtue conversation, if you want to hear us talk about any philosophical concept, any theological concept, just we're open to it. We want to have those conversations with you guys. So thank you so much.
See you on Sunday.
See you on Sunday.